with women, it's just voting is too important to leave to people who can't be reliably trusted to be rational, right? And so my least favorite argument is the argument that if you're a woman, you don't vote, but you kind of do vote, because if you have kids, they will vote, and so you vote sort of through them in a metaphorical way, right? You will educate them and raise them to be good, responsible citizens. So when they vote, it's kind of like you're voting. I mean, not really, because you're not actually voting, and don't go in the voting booth with them because they're voting and like get out of here. But and like also like leave them alone to vote. But like you're sort of metaphorically joining them in the voting booth as they cast their votes. Right? By the way, that was an argument the British made before the American Revolution, was that you Americans don't need seats in Parliament because you kind of have representatives already, virtual representatives that represent you. You didn't vote for them, but we kind of assigned them to you. We said like, oh, you do Pennsylvania, you do New York, right? And of course, the Americans pointed out that those people, we don't know anything about those people, we don't have any representation of us, we don't pay them, they don't know anything about them. But the British are like, but it kind of is the same. And the Americans are like, it's kind of not. We're independent now, like revolution time. And so when you make the same argument with women, it's like you're not going to actually vote, but you're kind of like metaphorically, it's like the same thing. And of course, as you might imagine, most women are like, it's not the same thing. Like, it's not even in the same universe as this thing, right? And so those relatively shitty arguments were used to make the 14th Amendment or 15th Amendment include slaves but not women, right? And as you might imagine, the women's rights movement clearly was sort of like, look, this is simply an unacceptable thing, and like it's just a matter of time until we're going to fix it, and we just have to try, right? There was this clear sense that like it's just a matter of time until we build up pressure until this happens, right? And in the course of the 1880s and 90s, particularly, there's a very successful series of drives to get states to let women vote. And then when that happens, the idea is women are like, well, when women go in and vote in like the state of Oregon or whatever for governor, and like the universe doesn't destroy itself, right? Like a lady votes and the sky doesn't collapse, then there's sort of a momentum. It's like, why not the federal vote, right? In England, they actually got bad because when the British government wouldn't handle women voting, they started getting themselves arrested. They started setting mailboxes on fire. They started breaking windows of Parliament. They started chaining themselves to carriages. They started smuggling themselves into the Parliament chambers so they could like shout at members of Parliament. And it was all very like the British were like, this is very like disruptive and very not British. It's very weird to have people yelling in Parliament that aren't members of Parliament. And eventually what happened is the British government clamped down on it until World War I was over, and they couldn't really stop it, right? And so it was not long after the Americans got the right to vote, British women did too. But it's important to note the 15th Amendment fixes one of those big problems about black people voting, but like a lot of women are like, oh, this was a really big missed opportunity to just sort of go the whole way, right? To just have the whole thing done and we could just not worry about it, but yet not. And again, that really good argument about the fact that if you free the slaves and you don't free the lady slaves from being sort of subjugated by men, it's like not really the same. And of course the answer is like, oh yeah, but like changing the subject anyway, because women is pretty much the limit to what people are able to sort of do. I mean, it's like there's not really a thrillingly great argument for not letting women vote, and by the 19th century standards, the arguments they use are really bad, right? I mean, to be fair, if you want to get down to it, the simplest argument you say is, as a man, I don't want women to vote because my vote would count less, which is that's a good argument in the sense of being logically consistent. It just makes you a horrible person, right? But at least that's a good argument. At least like, well, I'm greedy for power and I don't want to share it. Like, but like no one wants to make that argument. Instead they're like, oh, well, like hysteria stuff. And so the other thing we'll mention briefly, but we'll come back to, is the drive to ban alcohol plays a lot into that, because the prohibition movement is really a movement led in large part by women who see themselves as the primary victims of alcohol. Like they're the ones that put up with abusive husbands, develop gambling problems, and abandon their kids, and spend all the time in the bars. And so the prohibition movement and the women's rights movement kind of go hand in hand, because organizers, for one, are usually involved in the other, right? The women's voting movement is usually also, if you ask all those women, who here also supports prohibition, it's like 95% of them are like, I volunteer in that club on Thursdays, right? And so when you see those amendments pass in America in the 20s, it's no surprise they happen at the exact same time, because it's the same group of people pushing for them, and they view them as kind of complementary. If you really don't want to ban alcohol, or if you really want to ban alcohol, because you're like some moral reformer, the constituency you appeal to is women, right? They're the ones who come out and knock on doors. And so how do you get women to care about an issue? You're like, well, at the same time, like also we could support women's voting too. And women see this as like, hey, if we could vote, we wouldn't have to have prohibition. We would just be voting in favor of banning alcohol legally instead of having to do like a constitutional amendment, right? So we'll return to all that later. But it's an interesting little sort of digression, right? Having said that, what can we say about Johnson? Well, suffice to say that Reconstruction in the South, he's never happy with how this is going. Understandably, Amendment 14 goes sort of right over his head, right? I mean, he is not interested in passing it. He vetoes it, overruled, passed by Congress, ratified by state. There's this arm twisting thing that goes on, and so Johnson. There's considerable pressure, you might say, in the South. There's a little bit of a backlash. We'll show this picture again because it's a good one. But here you can see this is a Pennsylvania newspaper. And it's talking about the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau had the agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the president and made a law by Congress. Support Congress, you support the Negroes, sustain the president, you protect the white man. So this is for Pennsylvania voters saying, look, the government is sort of overruling the president. They're doing all this terrible stuff. The Freedmen's Bureau is bad, and all at the same time, it's this horrible miscarriage of justice because honest, hardworking white men are busting their ass while these lazy Negroes are living off the government, right? And by the way, honest, hardworking black people busting their ass while white people live it up sounds an awful lot like slavery, where the manual labor was not usually done by the white slave owners, but I'm sure that's just a totally different scenario, right? But you can see, even in the North, there's beginning to be, by 1867, 1868, a bit of a sort of a constituency opposed to Reconstruction, right? And of course, they're still Northern Democrats, right? Even though they didn't have much of a majority in Congress, right? Everybody thought the Democratic Party was done, right? I mean, you guys supported slavery and secession. It's like, how wrong can you be? But it turns out our political system, parties are surprisingly resilient. Right? In multi-party democracies like England or Germany or Israel, parties tend to come and go. In France, the current ruling party in France, La République En Marche, is a party that was formed like 18 months ago to support the candidacy of the guy that's president, Emmanuel Macron. And when his presidency's over, the party will probably go away. Because after all, like, we support Macron, he's gone, so we're going to all join a new party, right? And it's sort of the way it goes, right? We think of it as being weird, but you form a party when you need one, and then when you don't need it, it's like we're done and we just form a new party, right? In America, we don't tend to do that. The parties tend to be durable. And so everybody says the Democrats are done in 1860. Everybody said the Republicans were done in 2008 or 2012, right? It turns out that's not the way it works. And so you can see here pretty good evidence that the Democrats are trying to mobilize votes in the North against Reconstruction. And you see, by the way, for 1864 and 5, the Freedmen's Bureau cost the taxpayers of the nation $25 million. For 1866, the share of the taxpayers of Pennsylvania will be about $1 million. Geary is for the Freedmen's Bureau climber as opposed to it, right? So there's a little clip of that too. And then notice again the very crude, racist caricature of the lazy black guy, right? Which is the sort of exaggerated kind of character you're going to see as a stock character in American media for the next like 80 years, right? And so Johnson is not really able to capitalize on this too much because the fight with Congress is just too extensive. They fight too much about everything. To get away from it, Johnson actually goes in 1868 on a trip around the South. He calls it the swing around the loop. Takes a train all the way down the East Coast to like Georgia, and then he goes west through Alabama, and then Mississippi, and then up to Tennessee, and then back over to Washington. And along the way, the Republicans hire hecklers to stand in the crowd and shout at the president. They know that he's a nervous public speaker. He's getting better, but he's nervous. And when they start shouting at him, he gets red in the face, gets mad, goes off the speech, just starts yelling insults at the heckler, and basically disrupts the whole speech. And the hecklers, they hire these guys, and they prep them with lines, typically about asking Johnson if he's had anything to drink, right? They're like, you wait until he stutters, and then you're like, oh, you've been drinking? And then he gets mad, and he starts shouting, and the whole thing turns into a farce. And Johnson just gets angry and angry. It's like you can't get away from the fact that the Congress, they won't cooperate, right? When the level of dysfunction is huge. So finally, Johnson decides to take some affirmative steps to handle this. And word comes out that he's thinking of firing Seward and Stanton. Now remember, these guys are appointed by Lincoln, but now they work for Johnson. And in the Constitution, it says that the president appoints the guys who run the government, the cabinet secretaries, we call them today, and they work for the president. They serve at the pleasure of the president, right? Originally, there were three, state, war, and treasury. Washington picked Hamilton for treasury, Henry Knox for war, and Jefferson for state. We've since expanded. There's a few more in the 1860s. There's a bunch more today. But everyone understands that the president he chooses who these people will be, hires them, and also he can fire them, right? Now, it's complicated because some of the cabinet secretaries have to go through a process called confirmation, where you submit your name to Congress, and the relevant committee in the Senate will hold hearings to determine if you're like a weirdo or an idiot. Usually it's sort of pro forma, but they tend to ask you things like, so you're going to be Secretary of the Treasury. Do you know anything about like money? And this is where you say like, yeah, I ran a bank for a while, or like, yeah, I was a tax attorney, or like, I was the head of the New York Federal Reserve. And you prove that you're not a complete idiot, and we're like, seems Big clue, don't have illegal immigrants working for you as nannies, because that torpedoed a bunch of Bill Clinton's picks, because it turns out you can't be the guy in charge of enforcing immigration law when your nanny's an illegal immigrant, so that's big. Also, pay your taxes, which is ludicrous, because you could search yourself on the IRS and find out if there's taxes you haven't paid, but if you're going to be the head, like the guy in charge of the Treasury Department, which has the IRS in it, and you have unpaid taxes, like guess what? Some senator's going to pull it up and be like, hey, so you don't pay your taxes, you're going to make me pay mine, and it's like, whoops, you're fired. You don't even get the job, right? But generally, these things are seen as basically pro forma, right? If a majority of the committee likes you, they send you to the floor of the Senate, and then the senators by majority vote will confirm you, right? And usually these are pass-throughs, and it's sort of very pro forma. If you're not going to get voted on, you would typically withdraw before you even got that far, right? And so, interestingly, the first time in the history of the United States that there was a tie-breaking vote cast by the vice president was just last year when the president nominated Betsy DeVos to be the Secretary of Education, and she would not have been confirmed had the vice president not cast the 51-50 tie-breaking vote in order to get her confirmed. That would have been very, very rare to have a nominee go to the floor and be defeated. Because usually, if you would be defeated, you would just withdraw to avoid it being kind of embarrassing, right? And so, the other side of the coin, though, all these people work for the president, and it is understood that if you work for the president as the secretary of whatever, he can just fire you at the drop of a hat, right? It might not be a good idea. It might raise questions about like his judgment or her judgment, but it's understood that if I'm the president and I don't like what you're doing, I just pick up the phone and say, you're fired, get out. And I don't have to explain anything other than I like you. Now, reporters might ask questions like, why, and who are you going to replace them with, and what was the reasoning? But that's understood to be the president's power, right? So this makes Seward and Stanton sort of the Achilles heel of Reconstruction. They're making it happen in the South. They are making Reconstruction a reality. The Freedmen's Bureau is happening because Stanton is putting guys in charge of it and sending Army money to fund it. And if the Secretary of War were replaced, obviously you'd end up with two things. The first would be Johnson would get someone confirmed who is anti-Reconstruction, right? And they would just let the Freedmen's Bureau have no money, right? And then it would just go away on its own, right? After all, you're not closing it, you're just not funding it, so there's nobody in it, right? I didn't close the office, we just turned the lights off because there's no one there. And so, or even better, from Johnson's perspective, he would nominate somebody the Republicans refused to confirm him, and so no one would be the Secretary of War, which means nothing gets done, right? Then the president would just appoint an interim director, and he would just tell that guy, I don't want to see the Freedmen's Bureau in operation, right? So that would just be the way that it goes. And so to protect these guys, what happens is the Congress passes a law called the Tenure of Office Act. What the Tenure of Office Act says is that any member of the cabinet who has to be confirmed by the Senate to be hired has to also be confirmed by the Senate to be fired. Meaning that, like, Stanton requires confirmation to be Secretary of War, so if the president fires him, the majority of the Senate would have to vote that that's okay, right? The majority of the Senate would have to say, yes, we think that it's okay that you fired Stanton. And so you can see here is the situation as described in the 19th century political cartoon. Remember, it's a 19th century political cartoon, so they labeled everything. Here's Ulysses S. Grant and Edwin Stanton, War Secretary. Here is Andrew Johnson hiding behind another general, right? They've got a paper coup d'etat, a military takeover. And meanwhile, Congress, the cannon, is getting ready to load the cannonball with a ball that says justice. And the ramrod is the tenure of office bill, right? So it's like literally going to spell it out for you. Good guys, weapon, bad guys, right? And so, having said that, the tenure of office bill is in a particularly good fight to pick. No, it's unconstitutional. Everyone agrees that if it says in the Constitution, if the president can hire someone to fill the job, whatever process they have to go through, he can still fire them. Right? The only people he can't do that for are federal judges and chief justices, justices of the Supreme Court, because they don't work for him; they work for the judiciary. Right? But if you're the cabinet secretary, secretary of health, education, welfare, labor, housing, and urban development, the head of NASA, the head of the U.S. Geological Survey, the president can hire somebody to take that job and also fire them. Right? That's all there is to it. And so what happens is Johnson can't back down. He can't back down. He takes the bait. He fires Stanton. And it's a whole scene. Stanton refuses to leave. There's a big, ugly scene in the War Department. He finally marches off. And Republicans, this is it. They've been waiting for it. And this is the chance to move against Johnson. Johnson has violated federal law. By firing Stanton without getting the approval of the Senate, he violated the Tenure of Office Act.
Waiting.
They basically set up a trap, and Johnson walked right into it. Right?